Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Hi, Andy. Thank you very, very much for joining me. It's always a pleasure
No,
talking with you.
it's good to be here. Good to
Ah,
hear. It's good talking to you, Sarah.
thank you. We'll wait a minute or so, see if there are other people joining. Thanks, everyone, for joining in. If you'd like to let us know where you're joining from, that would be fun. I always love seeing different cities, different countries joining from all over the place. It's great. So chat is available to you guys, as well as Q&A. Feel free to use those throughout the webinar. Well, not really a webinar, it's a chat. I'm like mentally still kind of going into webinar mode. It's just a chat. Yeah, so if you have any questions that pop up during the conversation Andy and I are having, please post your questions in the text message or in the Q&A. My amazing colleague Drew is also here, so he can also uh, read those questions. And if I'm not getting into them, he will nudge me. All right, so we are 1 minute past the hour. And to respect everybody's time, let's go ahead and get started. So, Andy, would you please give us a little bit of introduction about yourself? Where are you? What do you do?
Okay,
All
yeah.
the good
My
stuff.
name's Andy. Okay, my name's Andy Whitaker. I'm in Indianapolis, Indiana. I am a software developer, architect, consultant. I've been in the industry since the late '90s, uh, and I've been doing event-driven stuff since 2017 and event sourcing since 2017. And right now, I work for the state of Indiana in their unemployment insurance agency, trying to modernize their legacy system and making it more event driven and event sourced. So,
Awesome, fantastic introduction. Thank you. And so you've been around for a while, which is great.
yeah,
Not to say you're old or anything,
I
but you,
am.
no, you're totally fine. But I think you have been around enough time to see some things. And
Mhm.
one of the things that always inspires me and amazes me about what you do is you work with government agencies and at the same time, you have modernized a lot of their systems, which is, I think, a huge task.
Yeah,
Working for any government, I think no matter where you are, things usually move at a much slower rate.
yeah,
And, a lot of times the budget is limited, the workforce is limited. You have to go through a lot of different hoops to, get approval
mhm,
for using newer tools, modernized tools. So,
yeah.
briefly, before we go to our discussion of the day, um, how has it been for you working with some of these older systems and kind of moving them into more modernized?
Uh, it's the word's challenging is probably the best
I can
word.
imagine.
And like you hit on the a lot of points. There's a lot of reluctance to change things. Also, it's not a uh, it's not really, we're not making a profit off of modernizing systems, right? We're helping to
Yeah.
make things better. So it's very resource constrained in a lot of ways. The biggest hurdles are usually is things are working, and so if it's working, why change it? And we usually have to fix things based on more of a reactionary situation.
Yeah.
I was actually one of the previous agency I worked with. We were able to do some greenfield projects. They had grant money and they were able to do stuff. And we did demos and sold them the idea that hey, if you kind of get out of the normal way of thinking, you can have some really nice features quicker. And things like that really sold people a lot were like the audit trails you get from event sourcing, or you able to loosely couple things together with events we did a lot of demonstrations to show just the capabilities you get. Um, so yeah, it's challenging. The good side is that you usually work with a lot of really good people who know a lot about the rules, and a lot of but one of the challenges are the rules are usually embedded in the code. They've been
Mm.
updated over the years. The laws change, and you got to figure out where things are. So it's a struggle. Usually around business rules, which is
Yeah.
where the domain-driven design also shines, being able to write code that is easier to understand for business people to look at. You talk in the same terms. And there's been a lot of, I've got a lot of, my team, I should say, has gotten a lot of, what's the word? We got a lot of strengths or a lot of moving the needle. We get a lot of push for that by having those concepts, and the team gets smarter. Everybody understands the rules better, and it gets easier to code. So it's been a challenge trying to get them to explain the rules, understand the rules, implement things, and being resource constrained. But I've been forced to work on projects that have grants, and they're willing to try and do more modern things.
Absolutely. I think that's really amazing to identify those. And I think a lot of folks who are also working on some of the older systems face some of these challenges as well, right? There's a lot of pushback against some newer ideas and newer concepts, especially like you mentioned, if it's not broken, there's no reason to fix it, right? There's nothing to fix. But once it breaks, that's when you have to put out fires, and you have to come up really quickly with some better ways to fix things. And I think those are really the true moments of opportunity when you just have to just grab it quickly and run with it. Amazing. And so getting to what we're talking about today. So we are, of course, in the realm of domain-driven design, event sourcing, all of these great concepts that can help. But there are also a lot of these concepts and a lot of more detailed parts of these concepts and systems that are using these concepts are quite challenging to put into practice. One of them being, one of the main ones is being the aggregate, right? We talk a lot about the aggregate. I've had several conversations with various people, and when I did my podcast several years ago, I think one of the first episodes I did with our CTO Allard was, what's an aggregate and what do we need to use it? Now, several years later, we're at a point where some of those concepts, especially around the aggregate, have changed drastically. Now we're at a point where thinking, okay, do we really truly need an aggregate in our systems? Do we have to have an aggregate per context? What is a context anyways, right? So tell me a little bit about your experience, and I'll ask another question, kind of tag it along with this one so that you can kind of maybe address both of them. One of the other points that I've heard many times is folks who are using aggregate, who are using CQRS systems, for instance, will come and say, hey, it took us a long time to really understand aggregate and really understand how to use it, why to use it. And now you're telling us, wait a second, we have flexibility, right? Sky is the limit. You can do things here. And, some people within teams are, of course, more open to these new ideas. Some people are like, wait a second, I just wrapped my head around this thing, and now you're asking me not to use it or use it in a different way. What are your thoughts on that as well? And how do you facilitate these conversations, not just with yourself, but also within your teams?
So I've been, like I said, I've been working with event sourcing stuff, and particularly Axon Framework since 2017, and I had a hard time getting my head around the aggregate and stuff, and working with the team. It is a struggle. We basically, I look at it, a lot of systems I work on, a lot of systems people work on, seem to be, I call it like database driven design versus domain. So you have all the tables, and the tables have joins, and you have the relationships there. And I try to explain to the team, it's that same concept. If I have a table and I have these other tables related to it, I have what's the root? And that helps a lot. But then people start thinking, well, the aggregate is just a database mapping. That's what it is. And then you have to go around and fight with that. So it's a struggle. The best way that my latest team, we went through several iterations, discovering, me trying to coach and trying to come up with the understanding of what the aggregate is, and it's about cohesion, it's about business rules, it's about these things belong together. And I'm kind of, I guess, would be an aggregate purist. I guess, is I've always worked with it, so it got easier for me. And like, but I've gotten questions from my own team is why do we need to do it this way? And it's, well, this is just how it works, and this is how it should work, and it's easy to test, it's easy to do all these things, and then you run into roadblocks that aren't easy to overcome, or not roadblocks. There's just side effects, or they're things you don't really think about until you get bit, and then you
So
have
give
to
me some
stop
of
and
the side
rethink.
effects. Like, do you have an
Oh,
example in mind?
oh yeah. So just a recent one we had is we have one of our aggregates is one of our systems, a workflow system, and we use a work item as an aggregate. And a work item has the root, and then it has different entities that keep track of it, assignments or documents that are attached, and they all make sense to the business. And you have commands and events. You can add documents. It all makes perfect sense to belong to the aggregate. But then we had a new requirement that the business wanted to be notified when the work item was assigned, and they wanted that person to be notified. And we didn't have a notification system. We didn't have services for that. So we're like, well, we need to get this done like quickly. What's the easiest thing we could do to do this? And I said, well, and that was probably my idea. So we could just make a notification as a sub entity. We'll just have a notification sub entity, and we can open it up. You'll clear it. And so when the business rules come in, the things gets assigned, we raise a notification event. It goes and updates the database. People see it on their screen. They can click it, which sends another command to clear the notification, which comes back to the work item because it's a command. The work item gets loaded, clears it, fires off another event to update the database. Works. It works until you realize that people assign and reassign those work items 100 times a day, and it
And you
gets
don't need to
reassigned
know
and
about all of
reassigned.
them, right?
and you have all these events coming in, and we're like, why is things so slow? Why are things so slow? And then you see it's creating all these snapshots. We try to minimize the snapshots. We thought we were doing something, yeah, it made sense. But when we look at the system, we said, oh my gosh, it's not just one assignment. That person gets it and reassigns it to somebody else, and they reassign it to somebody else. And the silver lining is we learned how the system's being used. Before that, we were replacing a legacy system which didn't keep track of the assignments. We didn't know how often things were assigned. We just kind of went with our gut. And it made it very obvious when we looked at the event store. It's like,
So you kind
oh,
of like the side effect was your debugging was great because then you knew where
yeah.
things were going wrong. Right?
But things are slow, and did notifications really belong in a separate context? Probably.
Yeah.
Um, and so how do we minimize that? And we still haven't minimized. All we did is we just scaled the services up a little bit, and it's better. But we've learned a lot. We put in some new rules for assignments and stuff. But there was it was a headache. And we also had one where we were keeping track across aggregates. They're the same bound of context, and we had to keep track because these aggregates they're related in some way. And we want to keep them kind of in sync and we know stuff. And that's a very challenging thing too. My previous experience, my first experience with it back in 2017, 2018, you would go and load the aggregates up individually using loading them and then basically interrogating them, and we run into locking issues and going back, is a lot of it was self-inflicted and not really understanding what we're doing and stuff, and the transactional boundaries and figuring all this stuff out. And so that kind of stuff kind of like I'll run away from. But looking back at like notifications or these things, it would have been better if we just raised an event with the event gateway, not tied to an aggregate, and just let the database get updated. And that's probably a better fix. What we might try doing. It's just we didn't expect it. It met the business rules. It kind of belongs to the work item, but at the same time, it was probably a bad fit for the aggregate.
Yeah,
And
and
it's
of
just
course, it's costing performance issues and things like that. Where
yeah.
this is one of the reasons why A lot of times developers and architects kind of are drawn into using things like, concepts like CQRS and DDD,
Mhm.
because we're looking for that optimization, right? We're looking at things to belong, if I can use that, in the right places, so that you can make sure that your systems are moving at a faster pace and they're more resilient and so on. But um, in your example, for instance, it kind of has the opposite effect. So if I can kind of put you on the spot here,
Go
now,
ahead.
not using the aggregate, how would that then affect these kinds of notifications being fired off to various places and so on? Would
I
that
think
have helped at all? And how would you do?
I think it would have helped. I think we should have
Mhm.
done is I think it would definitely would have helped the performance because the assignment would have happened, which is going to happen. And the assignment I think is part of the aggregate, but the but the um, we could have listened for an event off the assignment, and we could have used a command without an aggregate and fire off create an event that is just notification with an ID. And then when
Mhm.
they clear the notification, we can have a command. Obviously, they hit the command and basically raise another event to clear it, and it would never touch the aggregate itself. The aggregate would have work to load. We don't care about that event. It just happened, and we don't want to. We do want the event, at least the. I do want the event. I don't like just updating the database tables because if you ever play back things, you want to. I want to get the habit of using events to update the database,
Yeah.
but you want to make sure that you 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 do the state changes, I guess, make
Mhm.
sure that
Yeah.
they occur, but you just don't have to tie it to an entity that loads up or
Yeah.
has to have the business rules inside it. So
Mhm.
I guess it's about where you put the business rules, where do the and I guess if you look at the aggregate, the command handlers, they can live outside.
Yeah.
It's the same thing.
Yeah.
Um, it just yeah, it's a learning curve, and from an aggregate
Yeah.
purist, it's
To kind of
tough
break away
to
from it,
say
right? And I
to break
think,
out. Yeah,
what you mentioned is absolutely right, because within an aggregate, there's not just one command happening, firing an event, an event sourcing handler or so on. So there's multiple things usually that are within that aggregate, and it kind of step by step. You have to do one step
right.
before you can go to the next step before, and so on. And if one of them is stuck, you're stuck basically. So you're just kind
Yes.
of waiting for this aggregate to finally load and for its state to change and yada yada, right?
Yeah.
So I guess then this comes to the topic of just raising events.
Mhm.
And you mentioned right now, right? You can just have a command handling class, for
Yeah.
example. You can have a message handling class, and it doesn't have to be part of an aggregate. So then, in that case, would it become somewhat chaotic, so to speak, if you want to? And my you know
Hmm.
OCD mind is like, where's the organization right now, right? So how
Yeah.
would you then organize within the context and to go about it?
That's a good question. You just put me on the spot. I don't know. It does. You're not abandoning domain driven design. You're not
Mhm.
abandoning CQRS, which are all about keeping things in the domain in order. Business rules are implemented in a cohesive or a solid way. I think it comes down to maybe domain services
Mhm.
that were there's your business rules, your command handlers are on these domain services, and they're used to organize how the organize that chaos. Um, that would probably be how I would approach it.
Mhm.
Off the top of my head.
So
Uh,
it doesn't mean it, right? And I'm sorry, I was just like throwing these things at you, and
no,
it's
no,
like,
no, no,
come
no,
up
no,
with
no,
an idea. No, but I think
no,
essentially what you're saying is, and what my understanding is that, so the thought process behind how to organize your system doesn't change. Essentially
no.
you go about the same way you organize your business requirements, right? If
Right.
we're thinking about a context, for example, if you are in a context that handles a certain part of your application, let's say a payment or
Hmm.
a part of an application that needs to be processed. So you put them in different contexts. You still have to organize them in a logical way, whatever that
Right.
logic means, right, to your business.
Right.
And then from then on, you kind of breaking away from this concept of must have an aggregate to make sure things happen at the right order.
Right. Right.
Right. So going to the right order, just something that comes out. Are there ways to still have some way of controlling at which order the events are fired, or do
Or if
we,
you're
or it
processing, yeah,
depends maybe, right?
that's a good one. Yeah. Um, like with the event stream, you could use, you know, it was almost off the cuff. Like I said, I'm not trying to think through. I think you could use you want to have that state. Part would be you could load from the database or load from somewhere else to get kind of an initial state, and then walk through your rules and not worry about having an aggregate. But then you're working with the eventual consistency and making sure your database is up to date. So that might be a twist to that. You could.
You could use the event store as well, right? I mean,
Oh yeah, oh yeah, you definitely use the. Oh, you could. I guess you could query the event store. You could figure out what. Thank you for the prompt there. Yeah, you could use the event
Use your
store. You could query it.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, and you could use you know, like the sequence sequencer policies. You could do things to make sure that you could open an event stream and say, I want everything that was in the events for this claim ID or this work ID. Give me everything in that order. I just process it in that order and move through. That's not a bad idea. I think that's a one way of doing it. Yeah, it's a very interesting thing to think about.
I think there's,
Not,
I think one of the things that, and just, thinking out loud, I think one thing that might scare people off about, now I don't have an aggregate, might be, okay, so how then do we make sure something happens before something else? But, again,
right.
you have options there as well. You, yeah. So, great. Now, inside of a project that now uses an aggregate, for example, or several aggregates, and now you're at a point that you're like, okay, so we're seeing performance issues, we're seeing things that are kind of delaying us from where we want to go, or now, talking about modernizing applications, that's an ever-changing term also, right? The way you
Right.
modernized it back in 2017, now it's sort of ancient, right? Because we're in the IT
Right.
world, and that's like 2 centuries ago. Now we have to do something different. How are your approaches at this stage where you're like, okay, so we had that experience, we had our learning curve to learn how
Yeah.
to use our aggregates properly. Now we're hitting some real issues. What to do now?
I think, yeah, I think it's about, like I said, when we had the notification thing, we had these things that are causing us problem. It's about, like you were saying, just look at it. Is it better to, we have all this aggregate with like 3 entities or 4 entities. Is it better to look at these command handlers and say, can this live by itself? And you're making me think, I'm thinking my assignment stuff, could that just live off by itself and not really have to be part of an aggregate, all those rules be out? I think you have to look at how it's structured and how first you got to find the performance bottlenecks, and that's a big one. And usually they can be pretty obvious. But I think you look at, like I said, the domain service and those command handlers, and start maybe just start tearing them apart and start saying, well, instead of having this assignment being part of the aggregate, this work on aggregate, I have an assignment service, and I put my command handler over there, and it has to open up the events, or it has to pull off the events, and I know I'm this work on ID, give me the events for this work on ID, and I know the last one I had, and I just have to worry about the events I care about to make this assignment change.
Sure.
And pull it apart. That it's making me think a lot, Sarah.
All right, this is your lunchtime.
I want to go try. I want to go try something now.
That's awesome. Hey.
But I think that's how I would look at it. I would look at some of these harder rules we have that are embedded that require a lot of events that come through, and also are there events that are more just data related? They're not really state machine changes that are independent of a change. Like if I change, I don't know a good example, but if I change some attribute of a work item that really doesn't change its state, does that really need to come through the aggregate? Could that be a command and event that just we just enforce some simple rules, or we look for the last event where that data was changed, making sure that we're not becoming inconsistent or something, and then fire off a new event.
Yeah.
That might be a good way to scale things out. That might be a good way to tear it apart. Oh man, that's
you got to go, I guess,
good
dissect
idea.
your application and see, right? Now, like, 2 days later,
So
right? Like, and it's like this whole project, and you just,
no. So yeah, I don't do that. I mean, you made me think. We were, I was thinking about our talk today, and I was looking at stuff last night on stuff I'd done recently, and I did a big data migration. I used aggregates. I used an aggregate to do it. To capture the business rules, because I had to talk to different APIs, and it wasn't just an ETL job. I had to grab a bunch of different resources. Oh, move my camera. And I, in the end, I've created basically a little aggregate that fired off 2 events, and that those 2 events populated the database for that one record that was migrated. And I was like, now I'm thinking, do I even need that? I could have just raised an event and just let it process. Because the thing about this one was, I don't care about the events once they're in the database. It's a black hole context, so they're just going to go away. They're going to go away anyway. I don't care about them. I just need them there long enough to update the database. And
gotcha.
And so it was a good blend of having the domain-driven design stuff to apply rules and figure out the craziness of the migration. And then just in the end, just raise a couple of events to populate the tables I needed. I probably could have saved myself a little bit of work just by not messing around with the aggregate.
Right.
So
And
now,
some of those things could be, of course, the reason why we save these events are because they're important part of your business logic, right? You want to have something that you can maybe go back and have a data log of these things, right? Say, like, I don't know, IRS comes to you like 5 years later, and you're like, oh, let me go dig down this hole and see where I can come up with. But it doesn't really necessarily have anything to do with the rest of the system. So it doesn't have to necessarily be in an aggregate where it like locks everything else up for you to.
But you want that consistency. I did it because I wanted that consistency. I wanted to be able to shut the system down and bring it back up, not lose anything. If I did need to play them back for a short term, I did have them and I could modify some things. But in the end, I didn't need them. They weren't important enough to hold on to. But I was able to utilize the event streams and stuff to make it robust and make it easy to troubleshoot. So
that's a great example as well. So I want to open it up to our audience. So if you all have any questions and you would like to ask those questions from Andy or myself, we may or may not have the right answers, but I mean, I'm sure we can figure it out. But do ask your questions. Please don't be shy. You can, again, use the chat or Q&A. And if you feel like talking to us, of course, you can raise your hand, and Drew can help with allowing your microphone and or video, maybe even, to be active, and you can ask your questions. And it could be about aggregates, about events, about anything you like. Andy's been around DDD QRS for a long time, so he comes.
I'm still learning, so
huge amount of knowledge, right? Aren't we all?
Still learning.
I hope we always, we're always learning something.
I
have a relative who used to say, like, in a very grim way, it's like the day you stop learning, it's the day you're dead.
Yeah.
Okay. That's true. That's true. But yeah, so we are here to answer all of your questions. And yes, to this date, I haven't yelled at anybody for any type of questions, so don't be shy. It's a judgment-free zone. You can just ask whatever question. There is absolutely zero chance of any questions that shouldn't be asked. So ask them all. But in the meantime,
Yeah.
I can ask you something. I do have a question.
Okay.
When are aggregates necessary?
I I think they're necessary when you have I think they're necessary when I have business rules that require state changes, and I have and when I think of an aggregate, I usually think of a root plus one or two more entities. You don't always need those, but my experience, you tend to break things down into sub entities and things.
Mhm.
And I think it's they're used when you need to basically provide cohesion to a set of
Mhm.
business rules, and you have things that are related to each other through business rules. Like for example, the work item ID thing. We have uh, uh, we do other things we do like claim stuff and claims. The claims have belong to people. They have uh, just lots of attributes and lots of things that hang off of them. And having the aggregate with the rules around it just it in the end it makes things easier to understand. At least it's
Mhm.
been that way for me. So
Yeah.
when are they necessary? I think they're necessary when you have complex rules or business
Mhm.
rules where you need to keep things cohesive.
Yeah,
That's
gotcha.
and consistent. So
Consistent, cohesive. And I think, and thank you, Drew, for sharing the reference guide on aggregates. So of course there are, different ways of designing your aggregate and other aggregates driving from that one aggregate or child aggregates, parent aggregates, all of that fun stuff, which can make your life easier, but also more complex in some ways. But I think one of the other something that we kind of touched upon a little bit earlier was that if you have to have um, a specific rule where something has to happen before the next steps, or
right.
in order for the final step to happen, you have to have these prior steps.
Yeah.
I think that would be another way to another reason why you would need an
Right.
aggregate, right? Because
Right. We do to force the state. Oh yeah.
yeah.
We do you have to throw errors
Mhm.
when you have that inconsistent state. Yeah, and it does help. I mean it does help having it's easy to debug, it's easy to troubleshoot, easy to
Mhm.
think through.
Mhm.
Um but basically when the state's loaded you can just check. And if you're at the right place to change state or do something different, if not, you throw an exception. It just makes it, I find it very easy to implement those safeguards
Yeah.
at that level.
Yeah, that makes
So,
sense. And if our audience, if you all want to share some of the reasons why you choose an aggregate or why you don't want to choose an aggregate, those would be interesting for us to know as well. Um, so Andy, based on your personal experience and going forward, do you see this topic of, dynamic consistency boundary or this kind of killing of the aggregate as, we presented a couple years ago? Do you see this sort of helping some of the businesses who are using DDD and CQRS, or do you feel like it's going to cause more confusion than help?
I think it will help. I
Mhm.
think it will. like I said, I need to try it. I need to get there and do it. I'm thinking about now
Use
what
cases.
with use cases and stuff, and and we're still in the previous version of Axon Framework. I gotta get it upgraded so I can use it. But I think it'll help. I think right now, just my development team, I think it would free them up
Yeah.
and how to better tackle the problems. And if they can tackle the problems easier, they
Mhm.
have more things in their toolbox to help the business.
Yeah.
The business, my experience, don't really care how we get it done. That's been
Sure.
my
Yeah. They
experience. They don't care
just want it
what
done, right?
amazes what amazes the business is when we can say, well, this person did this and this person did that and then this person did this and this person did that and this is why things are we have this audit trail of what happened
Hmm.
of everything that goes through and we logged who the user was who can if we can't make sure we know who the user was so it gets traced through the system so we can say those things and that's very powerful when it comes to figuring out what problems are and
Hmm.
and also when we can build more resilient systems that they're connected by the events. So we have bounded contexts that rely on events from each other, and you can have a system be down. I mean, the visual consistency also it still throws people off. That's the business is getting used to that one. But we have a real robust system. We've had times where events are we've had our service go down or something like that. And we bring it back up, and it grabs the events that it missed, and it gets in sync. So it's been good for the business. I think they've seen a lot of positive things that come out of it. But if I don't think they would care as long as we got our stuff done faster. And I think by having the ability to break some of these rules out and be able to work with them separately and make things I think it would make things easier to understand if you have a command handler and you're just focusing on what you need to focus on without worrying about the rest of the aggregate, the rest of the state.
Right.
I do think the developer team would move faster. I do think it would help them, and I think that would help the business. So
the business eventually, ultimately, right? Because that's the end goal here. And you mentioned you want to play around with it, and I'm so glad because we actually so Axon Server, the dynamic consistency boundary, the version 1 of it at least is coming out pretty soon. Same with Axon Framework 5. Milestone 2, which makes it really possible for framework and server to work beautifully together in bringing this sort of concept of DCB into life. So stay tuned, folks. In the next couple of weeks, we may have some news coming out, and then just play around with it and let us know what you think. And if something is just not working nicely, or if you're just finding it, it's frustrating, whatever, just let us know. And all of that information is going to be on our channels, as well as our Discuss platform as well. So we have someone, thank you so much for asking a question, Marcus. He is saying, well, I think my preferred solution, or yes, so my preferred solution would be to use an aggregate. I thought there are just rare examples where it's complicated. For example, the classical student teacher and room example, where you have to apply an event per aggregate. But this could also be solved with aggregates if it would be possible to declare which events should be loaded for an aggregate. For migration scenarios, I would skip an aggregate and would just use a domain service which applies events. Did I oversee something?
Nope.
I think you're on the right track.
Yeah,
I think you're spot on.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, no, I think you're good, Marcus. Beautiful. Fantastic. So we'll hang out for another minute or so. If anybody else wants to share some of their thoughts or comments, questions, we can, of course, stay a bit longer. But otherwise, we can come back next month and talk more about some of these items. And Andy's so great that you came up with some of the wonderful answers for some of my harder questions, I guess. Putting you on spot.
I tried.
It's all, I know it's hard to it's hard to come up with solutions right on the spot, especially if you're dealing with a very complex system such as yours. It's just a lot of moving parts, a lot of pieces that you have to think about. So it's really, really great. Another thing I wanted to mention is for Axon Framework 5 especially, we are putting a Getting Started guide together. And I believe that's already live, but double check it, please, if you want to check it out on our Discuss platform, which is discuss.axonic.io. And that can help if you want to, again, play with some of these concepts. And another thing with Framework 5 is we're kind of loosening our ties to annotations a bit too. So that way there's more flexibility there, but more on that one coming up. But anyhow, Andy, I really want to appreciate you being here and taking time to chat. It's always great fun to talk to you. If you want to hear more about Andy's experience and some of his wins and challenges in the past, and Andy just won a really fantastic governor's award as well for all of his hard work with working with state of Indiana and modernizing their systems. So check out my other talks with Andy. You can check those on the podcast, which is called Exploring Axon. You can check it out on Spotify, iTunes, or Apple Podcasts, whatever it's called, Google Podcasts. It's everywhere. Yeah, check it out. Andy and I have some really cool talks.
It's always fun talking to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. You as well. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming, Andy, and chatting. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have a great rest of your Wednesday. Bye, everyone.
Bye.